Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com, and I'm here with our DraftKings NBA video for Monday, February 8th. We're going to start by talking a little bit about game selection. The last video that we did where we gave you guys some tips at the beginning on, how to go about filling out your rosters and stuff like that got a lot of positive feedback. So we're going to try to incorporate a little bit more of the theory of how we build our rosters in with, some of our picks, especially on some of the smaller nights and the smaller slates. When we get to like the Wednesday and Friday big nights for NBA DFS, we're still going to bring you a fades video and a plays video where we're going to concentrate more on the plays. But on some of the other days throughout the week, we're going to kind of give you guys a little bit more of the strategy to, help you build better rosters. So let's call up the slideshow and we can talk about what we're going to get into today. Three topics we're going to talk about today. The first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about game selection and which games you should be looking at and targeting on a night like this. And then we're going to move on and talk about who some of the studs and some of the value plays are that we want to be targeting from those games. There's a couple things that come into mind when we talk about game selection, and I'm going to break this down into basically two different kinds of games. Everybody knows that, if you have a game that's 200 to 210 points and the spread is between 1 and 4 points, it's going to be a game that should stay close. It should be competitive throughout, and it should be a pretty solid game to target for fantasy value because you're going to get a lot of points if you have a total in that 210 205 range. And as long as the game stays close, the starters should play their normal or maximum amount of minutes, which should put many of them towards their ceiling values. So when there's a game that is either well below on the total or well above with a very high spread, those are the kind of games that we really need to know how we should handle. So let's start with the first one. On a slate like today, we have a couple games with some pretty big spreads. Oklahoma City against Phoenix has a 216 total, which is something we would like to target, but the spread on that game is 13. We also have LA and Indiana. Indiana is favored by 11 in that game with a total of 206. So again, another game that we'd like to target with a lot of scoring, but it is an 11-point spread, which makes us worry a little bit about whether the starters are going to play the full game. And then the last game is Cleveland and Sacramento. This game could be the highest spread on the day, and could be the highest total and maybe even the highest spread on the day. Right now, Vegas is a little slow to post lines because there are a couple guys who, we're not sure about their status, namely Kevin Love and Rudy Gay being the two big ones. So right now, Vegas hasn't even put a line up, but I wouldn't doubt if we see like a 220 total in this game, maybe even above that with, another double-digit spread. So when we have double-digit spreads, there definitely is a blowout risk. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you handle it? Well, the way I usually like to handle it is I look at a game like this, and I would say to myself, well, OKC is favored by 13. The total in this game is 216. So they're basically expecting Phoenix to score about 101 points and OKC to score about 114 or 115 points. Now, if you have a team that's going to be scoring 115 points, what you like to do is look and see, where that kind of falls on what they normally score on a normal game. If you look at the OKC team, they have been in that 110 to 120 range in a lot of their games recently. So I wouldn't expect their production to change too much. Even in a three-quarter game, if you're worried about a blowout, then you're probably thinking OKC has like maybe 90 points at the end of the third quarter. And we all know if OKC has 90 points at the end of the third quarter, you probably got a big game and big production out of guys like Kevin Durant or Russell Westbrook. So I do still think you can look at the studs on a team that is favored. I do still think the team that is favored is going to be the one that winds up putting up, the same kind of numbers they normally do. When I'm worried about a blowout risk, what I'm really, really worried about is the guys on the other team. Now, in a game like Phoenix, though, we actually have some things to consider here as well, because even though this game could turn into a blowout, Phoenix has a very short bench right now, and a lot of those guys are value options and young players who are going to see minutes regardless of the score. Guys like Archie Goodwin and Devin Booker are going to be in there whether, Phoenix is down by 2 or Phoenix is down by 15 in this game. So they're what we like to call game flow proof. We don't really use this term that much with basketball. It's more of a term we use when we're talking about cash game selection for running backs in football, but the concept is the same. In football, a running back that's game flow proof is somebody who runs the ball when his team is ahead and is also somebody who's going to make catches out of the backfield if his team is behind. So no matter how the game winds up coming out, whether his team is winning by a couple points or losing by a couple points, there's still a script that is there that this guy's going to get some minutes. And it's the same thing in basketball. If you have a team that has a short bench or some young players who they're trying to get more minutes for, teams like the Phoenix Suns right now, maybe the Philadelphia 76ers would be another one that puts in there. Those guys are game flow proof, some of the young guys on those teams, because whether they're winning by 20 or losing by 20, they're still going to be in a game. They're going to be in there when they're close. They're going to be in there when the game turns into a blowout. So you're basically guaranteed minutes. So I think even in the games with a blowout risk, you can still look at teams that have short benches or teams that have guys that are game flow proof for one, reason or another. So Phoenix would be one of those teams today that I think is game flow proof. Teams like Cleveland and Oklahoma City would be, teams that are favored today that I still think can put up some big numbers. And I still wouldn't be too afraid of using some of the high price studs there. Now, the second thing we're going to talk about with game selection is what do you do with these games that have low totals? Like basically any game that Miami or Utah plays in on a normal basis. Luckily today, we don't really have too many of them. The lowest total game we have is Portland going up against Memphis with a 198 total and Memphis being favored. Normally what we do is we like to avoid these low-scoring games, especially on a large slate. When choosing between two options that you have, if you're looking at one guy who's 6,500 and another guy who's 6,600, I always try to factor the total into my decision. If I think both guys are in a pretty good spot and one guy is in, a game with a total of 225 and the other guy's in a game with a total of 198, I definitely let that, kind of steer my decision. So I do think it's important to look at these totals there. Another thing I want to tell you guys is I try to avoid value guys that are playing in low total games. You're going to see a lot of people talk about, let's use a guy like Raul Neto in the Utah game today. But Utah's not a team that scores a lot of points. Neto has been pretty solid lately, but as his price starts rising, he's not a guy who I think has a ton of upside. I would rather choose a value option and, like maybe a Dion Waiters in that Oklahoma City game against Phoenix. We know Phoenix struggles to guard everybody at the guard spot, and we know that you're going to see maybe 110 to 120 points out of that OKC team today. If Waiters is going to continue to get the 25 to 30 minutes we've been seeing him play recently, I think you're better off using a $4,000 guy in a high-scoring game like that than using a $4,000 guy in a lower-scoring game that, is going to need to be perfect or one of the better players in that game in order for him to reach value. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the guys who we really like here today. At the point guard spot, for the studs that I'm willing to pay up for, I'm willing to pay up for Westbrook going up against the Suns. As we just talked about, we think this is going to be a high-scoring game. Westbrook is very capable of putting up 55 to 60 fantasy points, even in a blowout, even in three quarters. We've seen him put up triple doubles before. So while I don't really like him for the upside, I do like him as a solid cash play. Wherever I can afford him, I'm going to have some Westbrook in my lineups. Another point guard I'm a big fan of today, you got Kyrie Irving going up against the Kings. Not only do I like the fact that this is an incredibly paced-up game where high-usage guys tend to outperform, especially lately. I mean, we just saw them play Boston, and all the Boston high-usage guards all wound up with, 5.5 to 6.5x kind of games. I think Kyrie, who's been playing well and putting up 6x against better competition lately, is in a really good spot here to have a big game today. Moving on to the power forward spot, I also like his teammate LeBron James. It looks like Kevin Love is going to be back. But again, high-usage guys are the ones who usually have the biggest uptick against the fast-paced Kings team. So I do like Kyrie, I do like LeBron, and if Love is 100%, I would even think he's a decent option as well. My only problem with LeBron here today is Nick Batum is about 30% cheaper at only $6,700 over on DraftKings. He's going up against a Chicago team that doesn't have Jimmy Butler, so he's going to be getting a soft matchup on the wing. Maybe Mike Dunleavy, maybe a little bit of McDermott, might see a little Etuan Moore at one point or another. All guys that I think Batum can do pretty well against. Batum is a guy who should be a $75,000 to $8,000 player. His production lately in the 40-plus fantasy point range has kind of proven that. And his price right now, because he's coming off injury, is still only $6,700. So like we were saying with Favors last week, before he got back up to his normal price or closer to his normal price, while these guys are cheap, you want to take the discount on them. And I think Batum is one of those guys today. At the center spot, you have three guys right around the $8,000 range. All three are in pretty good matchups. All three are in pretty good spots. And, these are three guys that you're going to have to decide between. You got Karl Anthony Towns going up against the New Orleans Pelicans. Pelicans have one of the worst, defenses at stopping big men. Towns is definitely in a good spot. Pekovic is out. Garnett is out. He's been putting up a ton of minutes, putting up a ton of points in those minutes. His price has come up to 8,200, so he's a little bit pricey now, but I still think he's in a pretty decent spot for 40 to 50 fantasy points. Next guy we're going to talk about is Brook Lopez going up against Denver. Again, Brook Lopez is a huge part of that Nets offense. They're basically running the entire offense through him right now. Denver's a fast-paced team. They got a weak interior defense, giving up a lot of points to big guys, so I do think Lopez is another guy in a good spot. And then the last guy is DeAndre Jordan going up against the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, Philly's big men do not rebound well, and they also get a lot of shots blocked. Two of the things that DeAndre Jordan does well is block shots and rebound. So this is about as good a matchup as you can ask out of him. He's not a big scorer, probably only going to get you between 10 and 14 points. But if he can add you 15 or 16 rebounds and 4 or 5 block shots to go along with it, he's going to be one of the best values that we have here on the day. And those numbers are not too out of line to ask for him, especially in such a good matchup. The last thing I want to do is give you guys some value options that you can look at. Now, if Tobias Harris is out, I think Evan Fournier almost becomes a must-start at 4,500. If Jimmy Butler's out, I think Etuan Moore is a very good start at 4,900. I like Fournier a little more for his upside and also because he's cheaper. But again, it all hinges on who's out. We're almost positive Butler's out, so Etuan Moore should definitely be in play. Harris is still questionable, so if he's out, I love Fournier. But if he's in, I think you really got to, look Etuan Moore instead of Fournier at shooting guard in that situation. For small forward, I think if you're looking for a value option, you can start anybody with the last name Johnson. You got Stanley Johnson at 59, Joe Johnson at like 54, Wes Johnson at like 52. All three of these guys are pretty solid. Joe obviously plays for the Nets, had some big games recently. Wes Johnson has been very solid, not great upside, but 20 to 25 fantasy points, playing a decent amount of minutes on that Clippers team that really doesn't have a lot of good wing players. And then Stanley Morris has been starting at the 2 with Kentavious Caldwell-Pope out with his injury. So he's seeing big minutes. He's been putting up big points. The only problem with Stanley is his price came up to 5,900. So he basically needs to get you about 35 fantasy points in order to reach tournament value. And while I think he can do that, it's not a slam dunk. I do still think he's in play, but, there are some other guys that I'm hedging against with and, my GPPs. Now, at the power forward spot, you can spend a little below 6K for a guy like Markieff Morris. You can spend 5,500 for Aaron Gordon, or you can spend down at like 4,300 for Bobby Portis. Markieff has a tough matchup, but he is back to being a big part of that offense. Aaron Gordon doesn't really have an easy matchup either, but if Tobias Harris is out, he'll see big minutes, has double-double potential. And Bobby Portis is seeing like 22 to 25 minutes now, especially with Mirotic and Noah out. So if you really need a viable punt option, I think he's one of the best ones. Moving on to center, there are 3 guys that are in that like 6,500-ish range that I think are good values. There's also a couple other guys around there, but these are the 3 I like the best. You got Gorgie Dang, who's playing, again, without Pekovic and Garnett, side by side with Karl Anthony Towns. The 2 of them have been putting up double-doubles a lot recently, so I like the spot for him. You have Nikola Jokic, who didn't have a great game last time out, but has put up like 35-plus fantasy points in 5 of his last 8 or something crazy like that. So I think he's another viable option we can look at. And then the last guy is Miles Turner. Miles Turner has a great matchup going up against the LA Lakers. Anytime we can pick on the Lakers defense, we try to do so. So I do think Miles Turner is the other guy I like, and I do like them in that order. Dang, Jokic, and then Turner would be the 3 cheap options I'd be looking at. So that pretty much wraps it up for our Monday video for NBA DFS. Thank you guys for joining us here at rotocurve.com. And as always, stay classy, DFS.